welcome back. And we're now going to have, I think, a fascinating session, which is about the balance between tradition and the future in the context of Bhutan. Now, Bhutan is a country, it's not that small, as Jean Wee, sitting on my right, has just told me. It's 53 times the surface area of Singapore, with 1/8 of the population. Or is it 1/6? 1/6 of the population. And so it's not a tiny country, but it has a very small population. And it's sandwiched between two giants, India and China, both of which have populations of 1.5 billion or thereabouts people. So, how it manages its identity and its independence and its uniqueness is obviously quite an issue. And Bhutan is tackling this in an extremely interesting way. We'll hear about it more from our speakers, but they're developing a concept called gross national happiness as a measure of success, of progress, which is quite different to the purely sort of materialistic way of counting gross national product, which is what has happened in the West and in many other places derived from Western economic models. Now, what we're going to hear about is hear about how Bhutan is facing this through the experience of one particular project, a very important building, both culturally and historically and indeed administratively for Bhutan, which is the, and I forgive my pronunciation, Wangdu Chilongling Palace? Okay, we'll hear it properly pronounced in a moment, which was built in the 1850s by the father of the first king of Bhutan, who was an extremely important figure in the history of Bhutan because he unified the country after a period of civil strife and provided the stability for the country to become a monarchy, position taken by his son and still held by his descendants. From that, over a long period of now getting on for 200 years, to develop a base for creating what would, I think, aspire to be the happiest country in the world, measured through this concept of gross national happiness, and to make progress in the way Singapore has made progress in the, nearly 60 years since independence. So our speakers are on the end, showing Yang Zong, who is involved with, who has been involved with the palace, and then Magso Dorji, who is from the Bhutan Foundation and understands a lot of what Bhutan is trying to do, and then Jean Wee, who is the president of the National Monuments Board in Singapore, who is very much involved with the conservation, the restoration, and the reuse of the historic monuments here, many of which date from the same sort of period as the palace in Bhutan, and some of them share a legacy of Buddhist thinking and Buddhist traditions. So we'll be able to comment on this in the context of a wider Asian perspective. So we're going to start off by hearing about Bhutan from Nangso, and then we're going to hear about the palace, and then Jean will make some comments. And we have a series of images of the palace, which has just been reopened last week as a palace museum, and it promises to be, if you look at TripAdvisor, which I naughtily did, a very popular tourist attraction for the country.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Jeremy, maybe before I begin, I would like to get things right. I'm Nakso Dorji from the Department of Culture and Dzongkha Development. I represent the government who was part of this palace project, and we worked very closely with Bhutan Foundation here, who is represented by Mr. Song Wangchuk here. So with regard to the conservation principles that we adopt back in our country, I think you've very well introduced the country in itself. As you mentioned, our conservation drive is mainly rooted in protecting our cultural identity and also in the preservation of our spiritual values. Because of that, to a large extent, despite the size of the nation, we have had many successful stories of being able to preserve our culture, and many of this culture in its tangible forms has been manifested in the architecture that we're talking about. The gross national happiness philosophy is very important to Bhutan because this was coined by our His Majesty the Fourth King in the 1970s. And two of the main foundation is on the preservation of culture and also on the conservation of environment. These two particularly are very important for Bhutan because now when we talk about the Wangdi Palace Museum and Cultural Center, it's very important to note that while the efforts of preservation continues to persevere in our country, but being able to make that relatable to the future generation is something that we've been working very hard. And this is when Bhutan Foundation, our partner, has come in and brought this beautiful idea of being able to work on an heritage sites and have them restored and readapted into a new use that's relevant not just to the local people, but also to the foreign visitors as well. And I think this for Bhutan is very important because for us to be able to share to the rest of the world that based on our gross national happiness principles, we've been able to take forward a heritage sites that is of the mid-19th century and make it relevant to the younger generation, I think, which is what we are discussing about how do we make our tradition relevant in this modern context to the future generation. So based on this principle that we just talked about, I think what I would like to stress here is Wangdi Palace restoration and the cultural center that has just been opened last week is probably the first such projects where we've been able to transform an heritage sites in this modern world, which is very relevant to the future generation. And this will also be a platform of exchange of ideas, which is what we want to foster from henceforth. So this is where we begin our a journey of where we can have our heritage sites more relatable now to the future generation, and also becomes an oasis of an oasis for where the younger generation can come and discuss about their tradition in this modern world.
Thank you. Would you like to talk about the palace in particular?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having us. I think in special relevance to Singapore, a small country as Bhutan is, I think national identity and just the ethos of the people, what does it mean when you say you're Bhutanese or you're from Bhutan? I think the same thing. I think Singapore, for many people, you look at Singapore, you talk about efficiency, right? Law-abiding. I think these are things that come off that people immediately understand. For Bhutan, I think many people who have been to Bhutan, in fact, just this morning I was talking to another colleague here who was presenting, and he was saying, oh, the people. I think there are many beautiful places in the world, lots of mountains everywhere. You have in the Swiss Alps, many places, monasteries, again, Italy, many places. But it's really the people and just a way of life that is exuded by just being there. And that is really also seen through the architecture, the Buddhist way of life that has really influenced all of us. And I think we tried to bring that to this old palace, which was gifted to the people of Bhutan and to everybody else to be converted into a palace museum and a cultural center. But when we do that, you do have the ancient tradition, ancient culture and all that, but we also want it to be forward-looking and embracing technology, for instance. So if you look at this palace museum, you'll see that digital storytelling is a big part of it. So there is a lot of technology that has gone into how many things in the past have been explained. Yet at the same time, we're also looking at culture as something in an evolving continuum, not something that's stuck in time. So this is not an old building with old things, but rather a lot of explanation that is still relevant to today's life. So by bringing these, using a lot of technology, but also looking at creating a space for modern art and expressing Bhutanese culture through modern art and other expressions of ancient symbols, I think these are some of the ways that we try to bring the past and make it relevant to the future as well.
One of the interesting things that comes up in these images we're seeing is the fantastically rich decoration, which I guess comes from, here we see someone restoring or reproducing the decoration. I guess this comes from a tradition of Bhutanese craft and art, and also, I guess, promoted by the royal family as patrons of local craftsmen and artists.
Yes, you're correct. When I think we were talking about the architecture and the arts and the crafts, I think, as you mentioned, this comes at a juncture where we transited from a very feudal war, where there was a lot of warfare, to a very peaceful state. So this, the paintings and the works that you see comes from that era. And interestingly, these are still relevant even to this days, because when we built our houses back at home, they still have similar paintings. But the wonderful thing about this palace painting is they were done by mineral pigment painting. So when the conservation works had taken place, we didn't know that the art of painting in mineral pigment had pretty much died down. So when the restoration work took into effect, the works also brought about reviving of this painting that in a way, without our knowledge, had died down. So this was another wonderful thing that as part of the palace restoration, that we were able to revive the art and also make it relevant, because I think, as we're mentioning, use of technology has now again tried to transmit this information to the larger audience about the uniqueness of the work that has gone on in making this beautiful palace.
And also using it as a way of reviving these traditional arts. It's interesting, when the Houses of Parliament in London were rebuilt in the from the 1840s onwards, after a fire in the 1830s, Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, was very keen to use it as a vehicle for reviving British art. Excuse me. Which, of course, he being German, he thought was basically German. But here, of course, you're dealing with something which is inherently Bhutanese, or at least Himalayan, and drawing on Buddhist traditions, which it's very important. So the palace was for several generations the residence of the royal family. The seat of government moved there, so it has combined both the symbolic centre of state and the apparatus of controlling the state. And then the capital was moved, I understand, and the building was abandoned or fell into disrepair.
Yes, correct. So this has very historic significance, given the fact that, as I think I was pointed out earlier, as Bhutan was moving from an era of feudalism and warring factions in different valleys and all that, towards an era of peace and stability, I think the architecture spoke of that time as well. Prior to that, you would find a lot of fortified fortresses that was largely defense in purpose. But now you're moving more into a palatial mansion and a manor type residential building. But at the same time, the governance was done from this palace. The first two kings lived there. The third king was also groomed, or he attended his father's court in those days, until the government, the seat of power moved to another part of Bhutan, in western Bhutan. And then, of course, as it was neglected, I think it fell into disrepair, and then that was when this whole process of repurposing it, restoring it, and then bringing it back to life to give a new purpose for this beautiful building, which is now a palace museum and a cultural center, that has really been the focus of this project.
So it's symbolic both of the traditions of Bhutan, but also the future of Bhutan in a very interesting way, because it's no longer a royal palace, it's no longer a symbol of feudal authority. It's actually a way of introducing people from Bhutan and visitors to Bhutan to Bhutanese culture, both of the past and what you're trying to do in the future. And that's why you're using modern technology. And we were talking earlier about how do you help people like me who can't move very fast or very easily. And that's obviously an ongoing problem in historic buildings. I wonder if Jean, you would like to comment on this as an expert on building preservation and reuse.
Well, thank you. And may I just first start by congratulating Bhutan for having such a wonderful palace museum. I actually, to prepare for today, I went to your website, and one of the things that I was very happy to see, you have been talking about reviving some of the crafts and skills amongst your Bhutanese practitioners. So there was like some figures for the number of conservators, the number of painters, and of the 4 figures, I think there was something like 34 fire detectors. So I thought that was a very important consideration, because a lot of effort is put towards restoring a building, but we also have to make sure that some fundamental issues like a simple fire protection measure is also put in place. And just to share as well, in some of the restorations here in Singapore, we're not just looking at fire protection, but we're looking at bomb proofing where relevant. And one of the things that I like to pick up from what Dorji said as well was how you want to make sure that you stay relevant. A lot of restoration work sometimes are driven by parties that are looking at making sure that the building is well restored, well preserved. But I think very crucial to the protection of the building is the fact that it continues to be used, it continues to be enjoyed by people. And I think that's a great effort that you are trying to put together, because it's also something we share. A lot of the restoration we do is a lot about making sure that our Singaporeans find their identity in some of the stories of the buildings that we preserve. So we have that in common with you. And the other thing, of course, since you're looking at adaptive reuse, some of you might have seen the 2 images that I shared of Singapore, where you see an aerial view of the National Gallery, which is a combination of the former Supreme Court and the former City Hall. So those 2 buildings were joined for the very first time for the adaptive reuse as the National Art Gallery here in Singapore. And in so doing, we also had to consider some of the climate controls to make sure that a building like that could also serve the function as a gallery, because it was designed to be courtrooms. So those were some of the challenges. Of course, we don't have such gorgeous painting that you do in mineral paint, but there were all the issues that we faced, which you may not have mentioned, but we have problems of rising damp. We have structural issues that we have to deal with as well, because of the, sometimes we also have some soil settlement issues. And maybe we also have climate challenges these days that we sometimes need to be up to date. Bringing back to the fact that Singapore is 53 times smaller than Bhutan, intensifies the land use pressures for us. Many times when we need to preserve a building, we have to justify the basis for doing so. I think maybe you have a bit more flexibility in Bhutan because you have more space, but the needs of the present, whether for commercial or for living needs, we need to balance that out, and therefore the justifications for us to preserve a building in Singapore is very much rooted in the national significance of that building, so that we can ensure that there is a certain narrative that we can engage our Singaporeans with over time, and the opportunity cost then is measured against that as a proposal. Yeah.
And I guess in Singapore, you've got the different traditions. You've got a Muslim tradition, you've got a Hindu tradition, you've got a Buddhist tradition, and then the colonial legacy, which is sort of loosely Christian as well, I guess. And each community then has its own traditions, and one of the things Singapore has done quite successfully is to meld them together. Do you think that the preservation of buildings policy has had much to do with that? Has it helped Singaporeans identify as Singaporeans?
Yes, I think there's been a very serious investment on the role of the government, because this is just one policy. We have the language policy that recognizes the various diverse groups. You've mentioned the religious, we have a very high religious tolerance. And so in recognizing all the diverse groups that contribute to this melting pot of what is a Singaporean, we also make sure that preserving the buildings that relate to those communities are very much the focus of our preservation intent. So we have 3 of the many Hindu temples, for example, that are preserved as national monuments. We have at least 8 related to Christianity that were started by the French missionaries, by the Anglican missionaries, for example, and of course we have those that relate to the Buddhist community here in Singapore. So I think we're looking at how these are contributing to the success of Singapore, and very much so. I mean, we look very much to racial harmony, and there's actually a day to commemorate that or celebrate the racial harmony that we practice here. I think it's maybe a little more homogenous in Bhutan, but I think this effort on our part is here to stay, and I think we're all very much enriched by it. Thank you.
And I guess, as Jim was saying, in Bhutan, Buddhism is the predominant religion, may not be the only one, but if you're looking for a religion to tolerate other religions, Buddhism is a good starting point.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we do have a majority Buddhist population, but also Hinduism also exists. But cutting across that, I think human values of compassion and kindness, I think those, more than anything else, cut through this whole ethos, I think, of how we live our lives. And even with this whole Palace Museum as well, that again, these are values that we feel like a lot of the visitors should be able to experience in sharing all that this museum has to offer.
Yeah.
And not just for Bhutan, but also we are talking about collaborating with many other museums internationally. You know, we're talking with the Asian Civilization Museum, for example, the Rubin Museum, you know, in New York, that is just, you know, and many others like that. I think there's a lot that can be shared across to really look at human values together.
Yeah. I was in Hong Kong last year, and I went to the Palace Museum, New Palace Museum, and the extraordinary thing for me, you know, which showed how ignorant I was the overlap between Islam and Chinese culture, and I suppose the Mongols are the agent in that. But it was very interesting that there was this interaction, and I guess that you know, Bhutan as a mountainous kingdom is a place where people have had to interact. The geography has made them interact. It's a bit like in Europe. Switzerland is one of the most interesting melting pots of ideas, of religions, of civilizations, and of artistic traditions for a similar reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was an image that was being shown here, and it kind of exudes what we're discussing here, because as you're mentioning, it's where people come. There was a lot of cultural exchange. We had a beautiful image here representing the fair that used to take place in this Palace Museum grounds. And this was exactly a place where, you know, people got to showcase, exchange their ideas, bring different experiences and share them. So this vivid image that was created, and this is now exhibited in the virtual form in the palace, was something that was trying to recollect this experience that was there. And another thing that I think, in addition to what Ms. Wee had mentioned, is also that to keep it relevant, it was important that when we started off on this project, it was not just the state, because in our country is mostly state-driven preservation initiatives, but here Bhutan Foundation was able to introduce a bottom-up approach. You know, they started off talking to the people who are living near the palaces. their experience of what they had experienced, their parents had experienced, or the earlier generation, and trying to bring that value back into this Palace Museum as we opened it up. And I think this is what makes it very interesting, because at the end of the day, if the local people around are not able to associate with this palace anymore, how can we reach out to the wider world? So I think that's something.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point as well, that it's grounds up. And definitely, I think we are trying to, we haven't done enough of that, but I think it's very important that you have them take ownership. Because some of them may even be employed to do the work. So I think if your communities around the museum also see how they can benefit from it, either through engagement and perhaps through some degree of commercialism as well, that will go back to driving the sustainability of this from a business model viewpoint as well. Yeah.
And perhaps we can go back to traditional construction. In a building such as this in Bhutan, would there have been, how would it have been built? Would it have been, who would have been the controller of the building process? Would there have been someone who we would recognize as an architect, or would it have been a chief mason or a carpenter? Or would the client, in this case, the First King's father, have actually taken charge and told people what to do on site?
Well, that's very interesting. Bhutan is very proud of the fact that when it comes to building tradition, it continues to live on from the day existed. So it's pretty much the carpenter who makes the head carpenter who makes the decision. Of course, it's always commissioned by the kings or somebody who was powerful. But it was the carpenter who was probably the architect, who was also the mason, who did that. And the wonderful thing here in Bhutan is we still have that tradition alive. We still have artisans alive. We still have the practice of master apprenticeship, where you don't go to a formal school, but you kind of work under a master carpenter and learn the art of how you do it. So this exists, and probably because of this existence is also when new ideas were brought in by our partner Bhutan Foundation. This could be translated very easily down onto the ground. And therefore, I think the preservation of it, or the restoration of the restoration work, was successfully done actually in a record time of 2 years. But of course, installation of the museum, curating, I think that took a little more longer than the restoration work.
Speaking as a curator, I can well believe it. Architects and builders can get on and do things, and curators will always find another way of thinking about it. But one of the things interesting here, one of the images shows some of the workers who all look really professional. They've got identical uniforms. They've all got their hard hats, which of course is very good for safety. So although the traditions still exist, there is some modernization here to improve safety, perhaps improve productivity, which I think is interesting, because the problem with traditional craft is that it is very time consuming. And that's why it's dying out in the Western world, at least, because time means money because of being paid. And here, I guess, you have a slightly different economic system that means that, as you say, you have a carpenter has apprentices who can be set to do things of increasing complexity. But I wonder if the painters go through a similar process. Do you learn traditional Bhutanese painting by working with a master painter? You don't go to art school.
When it comes to painting and some of the arts, we have what we call the 13 Art and Craft School. Yeah. So that one of the art includes the painting. We talk about even lacquering. We have slate carving. So there are these 13 crafts. So for that, we have a formal school that kind of teaches, beside what I just mentioned, the master apprenticeship program that exists traditionally. So that's why I think one of the reasons where when we talk about what you started off with, the gross national happiness philosophy, one of the core mandate is that we work on preserving our culture, because that's synonymous to our identity. It's also synonymous to the sovereignty of the nation in itself. Yeah. So therefore, there has been a lot of effort by the government to foster these institutions, and they continue to thrive. And they thrive even more when there are such beautiful projects that come into fruition at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, in that sense, beauty is a very useful thing because it already makes people feel happy. It makes people feel engaged with something, and then you can explain beyond their initial, as it were, emotional reaction as to what this represents and what it stands for and why it's worth preserving.
Yeah, this is, I mean, you can say that the gross national happiness has increased after this project. But seriously, if you look at the materiality of it, it is all local materials, a lot of timber, a lot of stones and mud. And traditionally, we wouldn't be using any nails for the joinery and all that. There's a lot of, intricate wood joinery that happens, mud and stone masonry that happens as well. But when restoring an old structure like this, and then to bring in, like for example, accessibility is an issue because old structures are not generally designed to be accessible to wheelchairs or handicap access. So those principles we found were very challenging. You could put in a nice ramp, try to make it as non-intrusive as possible. We even put an elevator to bring the visitors up to the upper levels. But even after you get to the upper level, each gallery is divided by a big threshold.
Yeah.
And that, again, is a very traditional belief that to ward off evil spirits and all that, you have these thresholds. So again, then you are met with another challenge. So like that, also the whole structure are not even, like for example, the walls are not very even, very uneven surfaces. So when you have display cases and all coming up, there's a lot of shaving off that have to be done, and it's a formidable challenge. But I think we tried the best we can together, learning as much as possible in trying to repurpose this so that more, as many people can have access to this place. Yeah.
And I think it's very interesting. Just the last three images have shown three very different sorts of display. There was one with a sort of table with obviously interactive press surface, press button and stuff. And then there was a piece of sculpture. And then there were framed drawings or paintings on the wall. Very different types of display. So the building can obviously take those, despite being quite old. And I wonder where the collection came from. Would it come from a royal collection or a national collection, or?
So, again, historically, I guess we are not really a culture of hanging on to things. We either give away or sell or give as gifts, and so that was a big challenge in trying to get artifacts for this palace. Yeah. We got a lot of artifacts donated by many friends of Bhutan who had taken, were given gifts decades earlier and lived in Switzerland or the US or elsewhere. So we had some of those come back, but the lack of artifacts also forced us to become more creative in the storytelling, which is why this adoption of digital technology and digital storytelling, I think is so much more interesting and relevant to today's youth and today's visitors, because then you can pretty much put in whatever content we want. When we do have graphic design, done, and all these storytelling done graphically, it allows us so much more freedom in bringing a lot of interesting stories to life. So that, I think, is again a unique position, that we were able to take advantage of.
I just wanted to, sorry, if I can just go back to a point that you made earlier about accessibility. It's something that we also face here because we can't keep up with some of the new compliance codes for fire safety as well as for accessibility. And previously, when we had planned for alternative entries, we might get some feedback from some groups saying, look, I want to come in from the front entrance. Why do you make me come in from a side elevator? And I think these are fair, fair comments that we might want to try and address in some way. I have a second point that maybe might be a question for you as well. You have now made this an attraction on its own. So it's a destination on its own. Is there going to be sort of a master plan to protect the line of sight of a historic building, its setting, and the access? And when I mean access, I mean in terms of, say, tourist buses or vehicles that might bring your visitors in, as well as maybe some of the spin-off commercial interests that may come, and this could be like a spoke and hub situation where you have an attraction and you have spin-off facilities in this close proximity as well. So are there plans for that, and plans as well to ensure that this site is not overwhelmed by some of the modern architecture that might want to be built very close to this?
That's an interesting battle that we have to fight. If you may learn, I guess, that right next to this palace is one of the Aman luxury resorts. But somehow it just happened. But I think we can work on this. But I do like your idea of this line of sight and all that. This is a very new concept for Bhutan. I think the urban development, a lot of places are still rural outside of the capital and some of few urban areas. So Pomtang, where this palace is located, is just about being urbanized. And I think there's already this recognition that we need to conserve cultural landscapes as well. And so this becomes a very, the palace and the 22 acres that it sits on becomes a very important part of the urbanization process to be protected.
I think I'm referring specifically to the setting as well. So you've mentioned the landscape, and in Singapore we also look at protecting the streetscape, so that you can look at the historic area as a precinct with all the supporting elements that lead to its or add value to its historicity as well. So this takes time, but I also think long-term planning, there has to be a consideration of the height controls. And you've mentioned how your luxury resorts might start to come in, because clearly this is going to be such a draw. So it's also part of the, I think in many ways we had to learn as well the hard way about how to put in some of these measures before it was too late.
Yeah, I think this is extremely interesting. I mean, what strikes me here is that you've got a building which, as you were saying, it's one of the first really prestigious buildings in Bhutan that was not built as a fortress. It was built to take advantage of peace, and that becomes a very different sort of statement. It's like, in England, you get the move from castles, which are about defense, to the country houses, which really starts as early as the 14th century, but then people built country houses that looked like castles. And then you begin to get, over a long period, over many hundreds of years, the tradition of the country house, and then you get the tradition of the landscape, which comes to fruition at the late 18th century with people like Capability Brown. And I think that's very interesting here, because the landscape obviously doesn't need much enhancement. Capability Brown got his nickname Capability because he went into bits of rather boring English countryside where his clients had got a few thousand acres and said, this has capability for improvement. And Bhutan doesn't need such improvement, but it does need preservation. And I guess that's partly, what patterns, if there are patterns of agriculture you have here, horticulture, natural flora and fauna, all of which will have quite an impact on the setting and how you see this building, which can clearly be seen from quite a long way away.
If I may add to this, I absolutely agree with what you were mentioning, as well as Jeremy, on the line of sight. It's drawing strength from our development philosophy of G&H. We have come up with a bill, which hopefully should turn into an act very soon, whereby we declare the entire country as a cultural landscape that needs protection. And just as you mentioned, the setting is so important. This is in the valley, and you can see it from all sides of the mountains. So to understand that all of our sites, be it with the agriculture farms nearby, or be it even with some of the built spaces, I think to understand them in a cultural landscape is what's important, because everything, be it the agriculture, is part of our culture, we're agrarian society. The built spaces, most of the traditional houses that are dotted along in the periphery of this site. So those come as part of this cultural landscape. And to be able to declare the entire country as a cultural landscape that needs protection takes a lot of effort. And with that, I think the planning of the urban areas, the local area plans that the infrastructure ministry works on kind of draws strength on this, and hopefully we shouldn't be disrupting this beautiful landscape that we've already created together with our team.
And I think the very interesting thing here from what you're saying is that, in a sense, the landscape, the physical heritage with landscape and the buildings within it, is actually the essence of trying to take Bhutan forward. You know, you've given yourself a platform over several hundred years, and indeed over several million years of the formation of the landscape, which has many great strengths, and it has certain attributes. There are certain things you can do there and certain things you can't do there. And that is, you're using that as a way of projecting what the future is, which seems to me to be the essence of what we look at here at the World Architecture Festival, which is how architecture, landscape, design can be a framework for establishing a future in more senses than just the buildings and the spaces. It's about how people relate to each other, how people behave to each other, how the opportunities people have.
One unique aspect of all of this, I think, that is very true with Bhutanese artisans and architects or masons and all that, is this whole fact of non-attachment of ownership. So there is nobody claiming that, oh, this is my design, or even in centuries-old frescoes and murals, you wouldn't really know who the artist is. You would have a wonderful piece of art, but if it is faded, its purpose is dying, because the whole purpose is to remind people of this samsaric life, and therefore to get away from this suffering. So then somebody else would come and put a new coat of paint or new paintings over it. You know, so likewise, there isn't really this attachment on, oh, this is mine, or this was done by this person, as say. So there is not a lot of ego attached to this product. So therefore, you cannot point to a Van Gogh or a Picasso, or coming from these kind of art. But however, this restoration is interesting because we are looking at actually preserving and conserving what was there, and that again is a new approach for Bhutan, because for many centuries we've always renovated. We've renovated. Whenever there was a sponsor available or funds available by the monks or the masters, you would maybe rebuild it. So the purpose is still, it still goes on. But this one was a truly a restoration and a conservation project. So which is a new way to look at how we manage and preserve our heritage sites as well. So that was interesting from that perspective.
I think that's extremely interesting because, of course, in the Renaissance, in the Italian Renaissance, painters did paint over other painters' works, and then as those works started to become really valuable, basically because American millionaires wanted to buy them in the late 19th century because they had made their money in coal or steel or railroads or something like that, they wanted to know who had painted it. Was it, a really great painter? And Bernard Berenson, the art historian, made a fortune by being able to say this was painted by him and that was painted by someone else. And he got a commission on all the sales. And I think the idea of, as it were, non-attribution is really interesting, because then that lets the work speak for itself. You're not trying to think, oh, this is because I know, every Leonardo or every Raphael and I want to see them all. You're actually looking at the work in its own right, for its own qualities, whoever made it, whether it was made by one or many more than one person, I think is a really important point. And of course, the thing with buildings is that they're always made by more than one person. Unless it's a tiny little shed or something, they are about collaboration, and they are about a combination of different skills that are brought together, whether it's in this case, largely carpenters, painters, masons, or, now you might include other things like plumbers, and in the restoration, the conversion into the museum, the people who understand AI, and not AI, digital, interactive technology, all part of enhancing the experience for visitors, which I think is really important. I think we're coming to the end of the session and we have to move on, but I'm very pleased to have had this, and I think it's a really interesting project about a fascinating process that Bhutan is going through, and I'm really, really encouraged to see speaking as an architectural historian, that the role of art and culture and landscape is absolutely integral in how you're thinking about that. And thank you, Jean, for giving us some grounding in how Singapore does this too. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.